The town never rushed, not even when the world beyond its borders pulsed with machines, speed, and the constant demand of progress. At the very edge of the state, tucked away between a stretch of soft hills and a river that glimmered like a sheet of glass under the sun, the town lived as if it had been forgotten by time. Mornings arrived slowly here. The air held the faint scent of dew on grass, and the streets, narrow and uneven with cobblestones, carried the echoes of footsteps more clearly than any horn or engine. People walked to their errands. Few ever drove, unless the distance demanded it. Shutters opened one by one on the row of weathered houses, their wooden frames painted in colors, long dulled by decades of rain and sunlight. Some doors leaned slightly off balance, their hinges squeaking like old violins whenever they moved. The first to appear each day were the bakers. By dawn, the warm fragrance of bread, yeasty, soft, and slightly charred at the edges, escaped from small shops, drifting through the streets. That smell was enough to pull even the most reluctant risers from bed, because breakfast here was not a hurried thing. It was an event that belonged to ritual. People would step into those shops, exchange greetings with the baker, whose apron carried the day's first dusting of flour, and take a seat on simple wooden benches. Conversation started slowly, often with long pauses, as if words themselves needed time to wait. The river was the town's heartbeat. It was neither too wide nor too narrow, but it carried a rhythm that residents swore they could hear at night. The water slid past the town gently, as though it respected the quiet pace of the people who lived alongside it. Children tossed pebbles into it after school. Older men sat with fishing lines dipping lazily in the current, and women washed rugs and blankets along its stone edges when the season allowed. What was remarkable wasn't the activity itself, it was how unchanging it all felt. Generations repeated the same gestures, as though bound by some invisible agreement that life here should not bend to modern haste. At the center of the town stood a square that could barely be called that. It was more of an open patch of land, marked by a cracked fountain whose water had stopped running years ago. Birds perched on its edge, fluttering away whenever the old clock tower chimed. The tower was the town's tallest structure, built not from ambition but from necessity, for its bell marked time in a place where clocks weren't trusted. No one questioned why the bell sometimes rang slightly late or a minute too soon. People listened, nodded, and carried on. Time wasn't exact here. It was suggestive, flexible, almost forgiving. The townsfolk spoke softly, as though they were always mindful of not disturbing something sacred in the air. Visitors, when they came, often left puzzled. They couldn't understand how anyone could live with such slowness, without urgency, without the sharp edge of deadlines. Yet for those who belonged here, the slow rhythm was not a burden. It was life itself. Days stretched wide, like pages in an old book, and everyone knew how to read them without rushing to the end. On certain mornings, you could find an old man named Hargrove sitting near the fountain, a pipe resting between his lips, though rarely lit. His eyes followed every movement in the square, the shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, the children tugging at their mothers' skirts, the occasional stray dog sniffing the ground for crumbs. Hargrove had lived long enough to remember when the fountain still flowed, when the town square hosted festivals with lanterns and fiddles. He would tell stories to anyone who cared to listen, but he never raised his voice. His words drifted out like leaves on the river, slow and patient, waiting to be caught. The soundscape of the town was unlike anywhere else. There was no hum of electricity, no endless chatter of radios in every home. Instead, there were the calls of birds perched on rooftops, the distant creak of a cartwheel, the occasional laugh that rose above the quiet and settled back again. Even the dogs barked without urgency, as though they too belonged to the unhurried rhythm of the place. Evening, when it came, carried no rush either. Shadows lengthened across the streets, lanterns flickered to life, and the smell of stews thick with potatoes and herbs filled the air. Families ate together, not with haste, but with patience. Conversations stretched long after plates had been cleared, carrying through the windows into the night air. The river shimmered under moonlight, mirroring stars that seemed closer here than in busier towns. Nights were deep, unbroken, and silent, except for the rustle of leaves and the faint cry of an owl. It was a place where the world outside felt distant. Even when news arrived, delivered late, carried by someone who had traveled from the nearest city, it was met with mild interest, not alarm. Wars, elections, inventions, disasters, they all seemed to belong to another world, one that spun too fast to touch this town. The people here believed that if they lived long enough, the outside world would circle back and slow down to meet them. For a newcomer, the first days in the town often felt strange, like stepping into a dream where the hours stretched endlessly. But those who stayed long enough began to feel their heartbeat adjust. Their steps slowed, their breaths deepened, and soon they too were captured by the rhythm. And once that rhythm caught you, leaving became difficult. Because beyond the hills, the world demanded speed again, and speed felt brutal after tasting slowness. That was how the town held on to people, not with force, not with persuasion, but with the quiet seduction of stillness. It taught you that a life could be lived without rushing, without the panic of losing time. Here, time was not lost. It was savored, and once you had lived in such a place, every other clock in the world felt untrustworthy. The slow rhythm of the town was not just a habit, it was a kind of wisdom, passed down in silence, carried in the way bread was baked, in the way rivers were watched, in the way words were spoken sparingly and carefully. It was not a story told in chapters, but in moments, moments stretched, moments remembered, moments that never seemed to fade. And so, the town endured, quietly, patiently, as if it knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. The mornings in that town had always seemed long, but for those who lived there, morning was never a time to rush. It began gently, with the first faint glow slipping over the line of the hills. The fog hung low, thick enough to blur the rooftops, until slowly the outlines of chimneys and fences appeared again, like old photographs coming into focus. Dew clung to the grass along every path, and it sparkled faintly before the sun had the chance to burn it away. The air itself seemed slower, heavier, as if it wanted to remind each person who stepped out of their doorway that nothing here was meant to be hurried. The bell in the tower struck once, its hollow echo rolling through the narrow streets. It didn't signal the start of anything urgent. It simply marked another beginning, another ordinary day. In the square, the baker, Thomas, pulled open the wooden shutters of his small shop. The sound of the hinges was part of the town's language. He stacked loaves on the counter, not quickly, but with the careful precision of a man who believed that bread deserved to be placed, not dropped. Each loaf had a slightly different shape, though no one cared. They weren't made for uniformity. They were made to feed the same families who had bought from him for decades. Around the square, other shops followed. The tailor, with his crooked back and sharp eyes, laid out spools of thread and pieces of fabric in the window. Though most of the town already knew he wouldn't sell much that day, clothes here lasted. Repairs were prized more than new garments. Down the lane, the grocer leaned against his doorway, smoking quietly, waiting for the first customers to arrive. No one rushed him, and he didn't rush them. Business wasn't a competition. It was survival, carried on at a rhythm as old as the town itself. The river was awake earlier than most people. A boy named Samuel ran to its banks, his bare feet striking against the stones, carrying a small bucket in one hand. He crouched low and dipped it into the current, his reflection rippling out across the surface. His grandmother still believed the river water tasted better than the wells, though others claimed there was no difference. Samuel didn't argue. He filled the bucket, stood, and turned to watch the way the morning light spread itself across the water. It was one of those moments that children never realized would someday be remembered. To him, it was just another morning chore, but the town's slowness meant even the smallest tasks carried a weight that lingered. As the day stretched, the square grew louder, not noisy, but filled with the steady hum of human presence. Women gathered with baskets, their voices soft and low. Men leaned on walking sticks, speaking in sentences broken by long pauses. A dog wandered from group to group, tail wagging, never chased away. Life here was shared. People weren't in each other's homes every day, but they were always in each other's lives. The town had no place for strangers, yet when strangers did arrive, they were met with curiosity, not hostility. On that particular day, a traveler had appeared. His boots were caked with mud, his coat worn, and his eyes restless in a way that belonged to people who hadn't lived in the town long enough to learn its patience. He walked into the square as though searching for something he couldn't name. The residents noticed him, of course, but no one crowded him with questions. He was greeted with nods, slow gestures that seemed to say, "You'll understand if you stay long enough." The traveler sat near the fountain, watching. He tapped his foot without realizing it, and the sound seemed almost loud against the town's natural stillness. He saw the baker's careful movements, the grocer's unhurried exchanges, the tailor sewing a tear in silence. He must have thought it strange, as so many visitors did. That time here felt stretched thin, as if the sun itself hesitated to move across the sky. Children ran past him, laughing, their hands sticky with bits of bread they had bought with a coin or two. Their laughter echoed off the stone walls and made its way into every doorway. The traveler smiled for the first time, though he did not yet know why. Something about the way the town carried itself, calm, unbroken, deliberate, had begun to shift something in him. Meanwhile, life continued. In the afternoon, old Hargrove, the man with the pipe, settled into his usual spot at the fountain. He noticed the traveler, but said nothing at first. He had a way of waiting, letting silence stretch until the other person felt the need to fill it. Eventually, the traveler asked, "Doesn't anyone hurry here?" Hargrove's lips curled into the faintest smile. "What for?" he replied. His voice was rough, yet steady. "If the day is going to end, it'll end whether you run or walk. Best to walk." The traveler laughed, though it wasn't the laugh of someone who understood. It was the laugh of someone who was still learning. Hargrove tapped the ashes from his pipe, leaned back against the fountain's edge, and said no more. That was his way. He didn't explain the town. The town explained itself, slowly, patiently, if one chose to stay. As evening drew near, lanterns were lit again. Shadows stretched along the cobblestones, and the square thinned as families returned to their homes. The traveler found himself still sitting, still watching, though the tapping of his foot had stopped. For the first time in many months, perhaps even years, he felt no need to move. The night came gently, as it always did. Stars blinked awake one by one, reflected in the river's steady flow. The traveler looked up at the sky, and though he couldn't yet name the feeling, he began to sense the rhythm of the town tugging at him, as though time itself had slowed just enough to let him breathe. He didn't yet know that this was how the town claimed people. Not quickly, not obviously, but with a quiet persistence. It didn't pull them in with promises. It simply showed them what life could be when lived at half the world's speed. And once you saw it, once you felt it, it was almost impossible to forget. And so another day in the timeless town ended. Not with fanfare, not with urgency, but with the steady rhythm of a place that had always known how to endure. The third day in the town began with the same silence that wrapped itself around every corner. But for those who lived there, silence was not emptiness. It was a kind of presence. The fog moved lazily through the narrow alleys, brushing against the wooden shutters and softening the outlines of the buildings. The river, as constant as ever, rolled its glassy surface toward the east, carrying with it the faint scent of wet stone and reeds. In this place, nature had always been the first storyteller. The traveler, who had stayed the night in one of the old guest rooms above the grocer's shop, woke to the sound of creaking boards as the owner shuffled downstairs. He had not intended to linger in the town, but something about it had unsettled his plan. He rose slowly, feeling the weight of stillness pressing on him, a weight that somehow did not feel heavy. When he stepped into the square, it was not yet filled with people, only the first signs of the day beginning. Thomas arranging loaves in his bakery window, a woman sweeping her doorstep, with a broom that looked older than she was. Everywhere he turned, the rhythm of the town resisted haste. Even the smoke from chimneys rose slowly, curling upward in steady spirals that seemed reluctant to leave. He sat again by the fountain, its dry stone basin cracked but somehow dignified, and he found himself staring at the clock tower. The hands ticked forward, but he realized he could no longer hear their sound. He wondered if the clock was broken, or if his ears had already adjusted to a world where time wasn't meant to be counted in seconds. As the morning expanded, the townsfolk began to gather in the square. An old cart rolled in, its wheels squealing faintly, pulled by a horse that looked as though it remembered better days. The cart carried vegetables from the fields, carrots still clinging to earth, onions with dirt under their skin, and potatoes in burlap sacks. There was no rush to unload it. Instead, people drifted forward, one by one, exchanging greetings with the farmer before selecting what they needed. Each exchange was longer than necessary, filled with questions about family, weather, and health. Transactions were conversations first, purchases second. The traveler noticed how the people touched their goods, gently, as though each onion, each loaf, each folded piece of fabric deserved respect. In the city he had left behind, hands moved quickly, impatiently, grabbing what they needed. Here, hands lingered, and that lingering seemed to give even the smallest act its own dignity. Children appeared again, chasing one another around the fountain, their laughter bouncing off the stone walls. One girl stopped to offer the traveler a piece of bread, torn from the loaf she clutched to her chest. She didn't ask for payment, nor did she wait for thanks. She simply placed it in his hand and ran back to her game. The traveler stared at the bread, warm from the oven, and something about the gesture stayed with him long after the taste of it had gone. Later that afternoon, Hargrove appeared in his usual place. His pipe was between his fingers, though unlit, as it always seemed to be. He lowered himself to the edge of the fountain with the ease of someone who had performed this motion 1,000 times. The traveler nodded, a silent greeting, and Hargrove returned it with the smallest tilt of his head. For a long time, they sat without speaking. Around them, life unfolded in its unhurried manner. The tailor adjusted his spectacles, threading a needle with careful precision. A dog wandered past, stopping briefly to lap at a puddle near the fountain. Two women stood in front of the grocer's shop, not buying anything, simply talking as the minutes slid away. Finally, Hargrove broke the silence. "You're still here," he said, his voice low, gravelly. The traveler smiled faintly. "I meant to leave." "Most do," Hargrove replied, tamping down the bowl of his pipe. "But not always right away." The traveler thought of the world beyond the hills, the constant noise, the urgency, the weight of obligations that pressed against him like an unrelenting tide. He thought of the letters he hadn't answered, the work left unfinished, the promises made to people who probably hadn't noticed his absence. For the first time, he realized he didn't miss any of it. "What is this place?" the traveler asked. Hargrove looked at him, his eyes sharp beneath the heavy lines of his brow. "It's nothing special, just a town." The traveler shook his head. "It feels like it's outside of time." The old man chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves rubbing together. Maybe it is, or maybe time just works different when you stop chasing it. The words lingered, not heavy, but steady, like the rhythm of the river. The traveler didn't answer. He didn't need to. He understood enough to know that the rest could not be explained. It had to be lived. Evening came again, as it always did, slow and deliberate. The lanterns were lit one by one, their glow spilling across the cobblestones. Families gathered inside their homes, the scent of stews and roasted meats drifting through the streets. From a window nearby, someone played a violin, the notes drawn out and unhurried, as though the instrument itself had learned the town's rhythm. The traveler stood at the edge of the square, watching the stars appear above the clock tower. He realized he had not looked at the time all day. He had not thought about the passing hours, the deadlines, the urgency that had once ruled his every movement. Instead, he had lived the day as it came, each moment whole, each gesture lasting. As he listened to the violin and watched the lanterns flicker in the night air, he felt something shift inside him. He did not yet know if he would stay or go, but he understood that the town had already begun to change him. The slow rhythm had settled into his bones, like a song that could not be forgotten. And so the night passed, deep and silent, carrying with it the promise of another day that would come not with haste, but with patience, as it always had, and as it always would. The fourth morning in the town unfolded with the same deliberate grace as the days before. Yet for the traveler, something felt different. He had begun to notice the smallest things, the way the mist curled around the rooftops before the sun burned it away, the faint rattle of shutters swinging open, the gentle hum of the river that was never loud, yet always present. It was as though the silence of the town had trained his senses to hear more, to see more, to live in the space between moments. He awoke in the guest room above the grocer's shop once again, the smell of fresh bread drifting in through the cracks of the wooden shutters. For a long time he lay still, listening. Downstairs, he could hear the grocer's low voice as he spoke with his wife. Their words weren't rushed or sharp. They rolled out slowly, as though every thought deserved the time to fully form. Even their arguments, rare though they seemed, never rose above a steady rhythm. It was a way of speaking the traveler realized he had never known before. Measured, careful, and patient. When he stepped outside, the square was already alive. Though alive in the town meant something different than anywhere else. The fountain stood in its silent dignity, cracked and dry, but serving as the anchor around which life revolved. Thomas, the baker, handed loaves to women with baskets and nodded to men passing by. The tailor had already set up his stool in front of his shop, mending a sleeve with precise movements that spoke of decades of practice. Children darted about, chasing one another in circles, their laughter echoing across the cobblestones. The traveler wandered toward the river, drawn by its calm. On its banks, he found a group of women washing rugs against the stone. Their arms moved in slow, steady rhythm, dipping fabric into the water and lifting it again. The sound of wet cloth slapping stone rising and falling like a heartbeat. They spoke as they worked, not hurried, their conversations broken by long pauses where silence felt as natural as words. Nearby, an older man cast a fishing line into the water. His pole was little more than a stick with twine, yet he sat with the patience of someone who knew that the act itself mattered more than the catch. When the traveler approached, the man looked up briefly, nodded once, then returned his gaze to the water. No introductions were necessary. In this town, presence was enough. The hours of the day stretched long, as they always did. The traveler found himself walking slowly, his steps falling in rhythm with the town's heartbeat. He stopped to watch the tailor thread his needle, to listen to a boy whistle a tune as he carried firewood, to observe a dog sprawled lazily in a patch of sunlight, twitching its paws in a dream. Everything seemed ordinary, yet the ordinariness carried a weight he had never felt before. By midday, the square grew fuller. A farmer brought a cart of apples, their skins still dusted with the faint white bloom of the orchard. He handed them out one by one, and children bit into them with wide eyes, juice dripping down their chins. No one hurried to buy, and no one worried if the apples ran out. There would be more tomorrow, and the day after. Scarcity did not live here. Patience did. The traveler sat again by the fountain, his usual place now, and found Hargrove already there. The old man leaned back, pipe in hand, eyes narrowed against the sunlight. "You've stayed longer than most," Hargrove said, not as a question, but as a statement. The traveler gave a faint smile. "I thought I would leave days ago." "Everyone thinks that," Hargrove replied, tapping the side of his pipe, though no smoke rose from it. "Then they find they don't much care to leave." The traveler tilted his head, watching the old man. "Why? What is it about this place?" Hargrove shrugged, a slow, deliberate gesture. "Maybe it's the quiet, maybe it's the river. Maybe it's just that nothing here asks more of you than what you already have. In the city, you give, and it's never enough. Here, you just are, and that's enough." The words settled over the traveler like the weight of a blanket. He thought of his life beyond the hills, the endless letters, the crowded streets, the way even his sleep had felt rushed, as if dreams themselves had deadlines. For the first time, he wondered what it might mean to live without those demands. As the afternoon stretched on, the town slowed even further. Some shops closed their shutters for a time, and people rested indoors. The traveler lay in the grass near the river, staring up at the sky. Clouds moved lazily, drifting in no particular hurry, their shapes shifting with a grace that seemed to echo the town's rhythm. He closed his eyes, listening to the water's murmur, and felt his breath fall into the same pattern. When he woke, the sun had begun its descent. The sky turned golden, painting the rooftops in soft light. Families emerged again, voices carrying through the streets as children returned from play. Lanterns were hung one by one, their glow spilling across the cobblestones. The violinist returned, leaning against a doorway, drawing long notes that floated into the evening air. The traveler walked the square slowly, watching. He saw the tailor close his shop, tucking away his tools with deliberate care. He saw Thomas sweep the steps of his bakery, though the day's bread had long been sold. He saw Hargrove still by the fountain, as though he had never moved, and he felt something within him shift again. Not a sudden change, but the quiet turning of a wheel he hadn't known was moving. When night fell, the stars came out one by one, mirrored in the steady surface of the river. The traveler stood on its banks, watching them flicker in the water. He realized he had not thought about time all day, not about hours or minutes or what he should be doing next. For the first time in years, he had simply lived. And as he stood there, with the quiet town behind him and the endless night sky above, he felt the slow rhythm seep deeper into him, as if the town itself was teaching him a language he had forgotten he once knew. The language of stillness, of patience, of presence. The town endured, as it always had, not through change, but through constancy. And the traveler, though he had not yet said it aloud, knew he had already begun to belong. The fifth morning began with a hush deeper than the others, a silence so complete that it felt almost deliberate. The air carried the chill of dew, heavier than usual, and the faint cry of a bird was the only sound that broke through the mist. The traveler rose from his bed above the grocer's shop, already accustomed to the way mornings in this town unfolded. Not with urgency, but with quiet inevitability. He no longer rushed to dress, nor felt the pull of unseen obligations waiting for him beyond the hills. Instead, He sat for a long moment at the edge of the bed, listening. The sounds that reached him were few but layered. The scrape of a broom along cobblestones, the slow creak of a shutter opening, the rhythm of a cartwheel turning over uneven stones. These were not noises to fill the air, but signals, gentle reminders that life had begun again in its unhurried way. He breathed deeply and felt, for the first time, that he belonged to the pattern. When he stepped into the square, he saw the town blooming into its day. Thomas, the baker, leaned on the door frame of his shop, his hands dusted white, speaking with a woman who cradled a loaf in her arms. The tailor squinted at a piece of fabric in the light, his needle gleaming faintly as he worked. Two boys splashed water from a bucket onto the stones, chasing each other until their laughter spilled into the air. The traveler found himself smiling, not at anything in particular, but at the way everything seemed to fit together. The fountain, cracked and dry, had become his anchor. He sat there again, the stone cool beneath him, and watched the rhythm unfold. He no longer needed to search for meaning. The town revealed it slowly, in gestures, in pauses, in the way no one measured time by anything other than the sun and the chime of the clock tower bell. By mid-morning, the market cart arrived, piled high with vegetables. The horse pulled steadily, unhurried, its mane tangled from the field. People gathered around, greeting the farmer with smiles and quiet jokes. No one pushed to the front. No one argued over price. A woman took 3 carrots and pressed his hand longer than necessary, thanking him not just for the food, but for his presence. The farmer nodded once, a man of few words, and moved on. The traveler noticed that here, every act of exchange was softened by patience. Buying was not about possession. It was about recognition, acknowledging one another's work, one another's existence. It struck him that in all his years elsewhere, he had rarely known such acknowledgement. Transactions had been fast, faceless, hurried. Here, they were threads that bound the community together. Later in the day, he walked toward the river. The path was worn smooth from generations of feet, yet still narrow, as though no one had ever thought to widen it. On the banks, children crouched low, tossing pebbles into the current and watching the ripples spread. A young girl hummed softly, her tune carrying across the water like a secret. An elderly man knelt with his fishing rod, his eyes half closed, as though the waiting itself was the purpose. The traveler sat near them, his boots touching the edge of the water. He picked up a stone, turned it over in his hand, and tossed it gently. The splash was small, but the ripples stretched far. He watched them fade, then smiled to himself. For the first time in years, he felt no need to move on to the next thing. The moment itself was enough. In the afternoon, he returned to the square and found Hargrove already waiting by the fountain. The old man looked at him, then back to the sky, saying nothing at first. The traveler sat beside him, content in the silence. After a while, Hargrove spoke. "You're learning," he said. The traveler tilted his head. "Learning what?" "To wait," Hargrove answered simply. He tapped the side of his pipe, though it never lit, and let the words settle. The traveler thought about it. Waiting, in his old life, had always been painful. Something to endure until something else happened. But here, waiting was not empty. It was full. It was the shape of the town itself, the rhythm that carried everything forward. As evening approached, the town gathered. Families spilled from their homes, voices weaving together in the square. Lanterns flickered to life, their glow washing the cobblestones in gold. The tailor's shop was dark now, the baker's shelves empty, the grocer's shutters drawn. But no one hurried home. They lingered in the square, talking softly, children still chasing shadows. The violinist returned once more, standing by his doorway. The notes drifted slowly, stretching across the night, carrying with them the weight of memory and belonging. The traveler leaned back against the fountain, eyes half closed, and let the music sink into him. He could not remember the last time he had listened so fully. The stars appeared above, one by one, mirrored in the still river. The night deepened, the lanterns burned lower, and the town quieted once more. Yet the traveler felt no fear of silence. He had begun to understand that here, silence was not absence. It was presence. It was life itself, lived without rush, without demand, without the pressure of a ticking clock. And so another day ended, stretching long into memory, leaving behind not urgency, but peace. The traveler did not know how long he would remain in the town. Perhaps another day, perhaps forever. But he knew, without question, that he had already been changed. The slow rhythm had entered him, and there was no turning back. The town's rhythm had slowed even further as the summer deepened into its warmest weeks. By now, the patterns of daily life in that timeless place had grown so familiar, so deeply ingrained, that it felt as though the town itself were breathing with a steady, measured patience. The air carried with it the heavy fragrance of ripe fruit from backyard orchards, of cut grass left drying in the sun, of warm wood that had baked for hours under the unrelenting daylight. Crickets had taken up their nightly duties, beginning their chorus even before the sun had disappeared, as if impatient for the coolness that twilight would bring. In the evenings, when the heat still clung to the roads and the paint on fences seemed to release its faint scent into the air, the townspeople drifted toward familiar gathering places. The square, with its fountain in the middle, was one of those places. By day, it seemed almost ordinary, a stone basin with a trickle of water, surrounded by benches. But as evening fell, children leaned over its edges, their reflections rippling as they tried to cup the cool water in their hands. Older men leaned against the benches, sharing stories they had likely told hundreds of times before, each story worn smooth like a stone from repetition. There was no sense of urgency in these gatherings. A man might pause for a long time between sentences, watching the way moths danced around the street lamps before continuing his thought. No one rushed him. The town was a place where pauses carried their own weight, where silence was as much a part of conversation as words themselves. Sometimes, the faint strains of music could be heard drifting from open windows. A piano played softly in one of the larger houses, an instrument that had been in the family for generations, its keys slightly uneven, but still carrying a warm, inviting sound. The tune wasn't always recognizable, but that hardly mattered. The people who passed by slowed their steps just to listen, allowing the music to seep into them. The sound was a reminder that time here was not measured by minutes or hours, but by rhythms, by the slow turning of seasons, by the comfort of things repeated and familiar. At night, the town seemed to breathe differently. The darkness brought with it a stillness that settled over everything like a heavy quilt. Porch lights flickered on, one by one, small pockets of amber glow pushing against the shadows. Families lingered outside longer than they did during the day. Children caught fireflies in jars, holding them close as though they were tiny lanterns to carry home. The adults sat in wicker chairs, their voices low, sharing stories that drifted lazily into the night air. Every so often, a laugh would cut through the darkness, rising above the quiet hum of insects. But perhaps the most striking thing was the way the town seemed to suspend time altogether once the stars appeared. The sky stretched endlessly, dotted with points of light that seemed sharper, clearer than anywhere else. People tilted their heads back, letting the vastness remind them of how small their own troubles were. In those moments, it was easy to believe the town had existed forever and would go on existing just the same, untouched by the outside world. In the early hours of the morning, before dawn, the stillness reached its peak. A faint mist sometimes crept along the riverbanks, curling between trees and settling low in the fields. The cobblestone streets were deserted, The fountains trickle louder in the absence of voices. Windows glowed faintly with lamplight, as a few townspeople began their quiet routines. Bakers preparing dough, farmers setting out before the sun. These were the hours when the town seemed most timeless, as if its roots stretched deep into some unbroken past. Even the animals seemed to fall in line with the rhythm. Dogs padded slowly along fences, tails wagging lazily. Horses shifted in their stables, their movements unhurried. Birds stirred on their branches, their songs waiting for the right moment to break the silence. And when the first light of day finally appeared, the whole town seemed to rise together. Not with alarm or rush, but with a collective sigh, ready to repeat its patterns all over again. The charm of this place lay not in what it had, but in what it didn't. There were no crowds pressing forward, no relentless demands, no restless energy clawing for more. Instead, there was patience, a kind of endurance, a reminder that life could still be lived at a gentler pace, that every detail, a crack in the stone, the tilt of a roof, the whisper of wind through the trees, was worth noticing. And so the town carried on, day after day, night after night, each moment folding softly into the next. To anyone who stayed long enough, the line between days began to blur. Was that yesterday when the old man told his story by the fountain? Or last week? Did it matter? The memory lingered the same way the scent of the orchards did, in the air, in the stones, in the very rhythm of the place. It was, in every sense, timeless, and in its slow rhythm there was comfort. By the time autumn's first hints touched the timeless town, the air itself seemed to change its character. The long, lingering warmth of summer gave way to something more delicate, more fragile, as though the days had learned to whisper instead of sing. The sunlight, once heavy and golden, now slanted at gentler angles, scattering softer light across rooftops and cobblestones. Shadows stretched longer, following townspeople as they moved unhurriedly through their routines. It was as if the town's rhythm, already slow and steady, had shifted into an even deeper calm, like the steady heartbeat of something that knew time was endless. The trees were the first to announce the change. Leaves began to blush faintly at the edges, a wash of amber, scarlet, and gold creeping in quietly before anyone quite noticed. Soon, entire branches were ablaze with color. The orchards that had filled the summer air with sweetness now offered baskets of apples, each one carrying the crisp scent of earth and sky. Children walked home with their arms full, biting into fruit as they went, juice running down their chins. The crunch echoed faintly in the stillness, like small bells chiming against the silence. In the mornings, mist hovered low over the fields, curling around fence posts and barn roofs, blurring the edges of the familiar world. The sound of wagon wheels rolling over cobblestones cut through the haze, slow and steady, carrying farmers toward the market square. The town woke in these quiet hours, not with haste, but with intention. Each step, each sound, folded neatly into the rhythm that had always defined life here. Even the market, usually the liveliest spot, seemed subdued under autumn's touch, as though the season itself had slowed voices and softened laughter. By midday, the square filled with its ordinary scenes: baskets of apples, jars of honey, bolts of fabric stacked carefully on wooden tables. The smell of bread drifted from the bakery, warm and steady, drawing in both townspeople and travelers. People lingered longer than necessary at the stalls, not because they couldn't decide, but because conversation mattered as much as the goods themselves. A woman might pause to inspect a jar of preserves, but spend more time talking about how her grandmother used to make the same thing. A man might offer apples to a neighbor for no reason other than the fact that he had more than he needed. The rhythm of exchange wasn't about profit. It was about connection, about weaving the lives of people together in ways so subtle they often went unnoticed. And always, in the background, the fountain's water whispered its steady song. marking time not with urgency, but with the kind of patience that could carry on forever. Evenings in autumn carried a different weight than summer's easy nights. The air cooled quickly, urging people indoors sooner, though no one seemed to mind. Windows glowed warmly against the dark, spilling golden light onto the quiet streets. Families gathered at tables, their voices hushed and content. A pot of stew simmered here. The scent of roasted vegetables lingered there. Every house seemed to breathe with its own kind of comfort. And from the outside, one could almost imagine that behind every curtain, life unfolded in much the same way, steady, unhurried, quietly complete. Yet for all the calmness, there was also a sense of preparation in the air, as though the town knew it was bracing for something deeper, something slower still. Farmers stacked wood for the winter. Children collected pine cones and chestnuts, piling them high as if building treasures for the cold months ahead. On certain evenings, the townsfolk would gather near the square, not for a festival or an event, but simply to watch the leaves fall. They would stand quietly, hands tucked into pockets, as the wind tugged at the trees and sent showers of color drifting downward. The ground became a quilt of red and gold, crunching softly beneath careful steps. There was poetry in the way the town surrendered to change without resistance. No one hurried the season forward, no one clung to the one before. It was enough simply to notice the way the days grew shorter, the way the nights pressed closer, the way the stars seemed sharper in the clear, cooling sky, and noticing itself became an act of reverence. Sometimes, in the very late hours, after the town had gone quiet, the faint sound of a fiddle could be heard from one of the houses. The tune would rise and fall softly, threading through the dark streets like a secret. It wasn't music meant to stir or excite. It was music meant to remind, to soothe, to keep company with the night itself. Those who heard it never spoke of it the next day, as though acknowledging it might break the spell. But in those brief moments, the town seemed to hum along, each shuttered window and stone pathway resonating with the melody. The animals, too, seemed to take part in this slowing rhythm. Dogs curled on porches, their ears twitching at the faintest sounds, but otherwise motionless. Horses stamped gently in their stalls, their breath visible in the cooling night air. Even the river seemed quieter, its current slowed, reflecting the stars without a ripple. The timeless town had always moved slowly, but in autumn, its pace felt almost sacred. Every sound lingered longer. Every sight carried a sharper beauty. A leaf falling to the ground was not just a leaf. It was an entire season captured in a single moment, a reminder that even in stillness, change was always happening. And so the people lived within this rhythm, their lives woven seamlessly into the season's fabric. There was no rush, no demand, no push toward something faster. Instead, there was acceptance, patience, and a quiet joy in the knowledge that everything would return again, in its own time. The town story continued not with sudden turns, but with slow, steady unfolding, like the leaves drifting down, like the mist creeping over the fields, like the eternal beat of a place that belonged not to the clock, but to the rhythm of time itself. Winter did not arrive in the timeless town with sudden storms or sharp alarms. It arrived quietly, like an old friend walking up the lane at a pace so unhurried that no one could say exactly when it first appeared. The air shifted first, cooler, crisper, and carrying with it the faint bite that hinted at frost. Then came the silence, deeper than before, as if the very earth had drawn a blanket over itself to rest. Leaves that had once blazed with fiery colors were now gone. Their remnants gathered into soft piles at the edges of cobblestone paths. Bare branches stretched against a pale sky, tracing delicate lines like ink across parchment. The mornings became a theater of breath and mist. When the sun finally rose, it painted the fields with a pale gold that glimmered faintly against the frost. Farmers emerged from their homes bundled in coats and scarves, their steps crunching through the frozen earth. Each sound carried further in the cold air. The creak of wagon wheels, the bark of a dog, the faint whistle of a man walking to the mill. Even the smallest noise seemed to echo, as though the world itself had grown larger, emptier, and more resonant. The square, once lively with colors and baskets of produce, transformed into something quieter. The fountain continued to flow, but now its edges were rimmed with thin lacework of ice. Children, their cheeks flushed red from the cold, leaned close to watch the frozen patterns form and melt again when touched by sunlight. The market stalls stood fewer in number, but their warmth seemed amplified. Jars of preserves, bundles of firewood, woolen mittens knit with care. Transactions were still slow, still wrapped in long conversations, but there was a softness in the way people lingered, as though time itself had bent lower to meet them. Evenings were wrapped in a hush that belonged uniquely to winter. The sun dipped sooner, shadows stretched longer, and windows glowed more brightly against the dark. Inside homes, hearths crackled and cast flickering light against walls. The scent of wood smoke drifted lazily through the streets, weaving with the cool night air until the entire town smelled of fire and earth. Families gathered closer, their voices low, their laughter muffled but warm. The rhythm of life did not quicken. It grew slower still, each movement deliberate, each silence held with care. There were traditions, small and steady, that defined the season. Once each week, townsfolk gathered in the square to share hot cider brewed with cinnamon, steam rising from their cups as they stood in clusters, their words misting into the air before them. Children bundled tightly in scarves chased one another around the benches, their shouts echoing through the quiet streets. Sometimes a fiddler played, the bow gliding over strings in tunes that felt both merry and solemn at once. The music rose into the crisp air and settled into the bones of the town like a familiar story retold. The snow came gradually, first as flurries that dusted rooftops and softened the lines of the fences, then as steady falls that blanketed the square, the orchards, the quiet riverbanks. The town did not resist it. Instead, it adjusted, folding snow into its rhythm as naturally as it had folded leaves, sunlight, and shadows before. Paths were cleared with slow shovels. Children dragged sleds over the gentle slopes near the fields, and lanterns glowed brighter to cut through the white nights. Nighttime in winter carried its own kind of eternity. The stars seemed sharper, their brilliance magnified by the stillness of the snow-covered world. From doorsteps, families gazed upward, their breaths visible as they spoke of constellations, their words carrying softly through the silent air. Dogs curled tighter at their feet, and horses shifted gently in their stables, the sound of hooves muffled by straw. The river, slowed by ice, reflected the moonlight in pieces, as if holding fragments of the sky in its current. Winter in the town was not harsh, not unkind. It was patient, asking only for quiet attention. It reminded its people to gather close, to move deliberately, to cherish the warmth of simple things. A loaf of bread, a knitted scarf, a shared fire. The rhythm of the town deepened, slower even than before, like the measured beat of a heart at rest. And in that slowness, the timelessness of the place revealed itself most clearly. For while the world outside might have rushed forward, chasing deadlines, chasing growth, chasing noise, here time remained loyal only to the turning of the seasons. The snow fell not as an interruption, but as another note in the endless song the town had always sung. The people listened, lived within it, and carried on, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty that nothing was missing. The timeless town, wrapped in winter's embrace, seemed less like a place and more like a memory made real, unfolding day by day, breath by breath, snowflake by snowflake. And within that memory, life continued, unbroken, unhurried, eternal in its slow, steady rhythm. The deep heart of winter held the town in a kind of suspension, as though every street, every roof line, every stretch of bare branch had been folded into a single vast pause. The snow no longer came in hesitant flurries or brief storms. It came in thick, steady curtains, drifting down hour after hour until the cobblestones disappeared under soft white layers. Footprints filled quickly, paths blurred, and fences stood only half visible, their posts wearing caps of snow that grew heavier each day. And yet, within this stillness, life continued, slower, quieter, but steady. The town did not fight the season. It leaned into it. Doors creaked open in the mornings to release bundled figures, their breath billowing into the icy air as they went about their careful routines. A woman carrying a basket to her neighbor's house took twice the time she might in summer, her steps cautious along the slick stones. But there was no impatience in her walk. The time belonged to the season, not the clock. The market square, once filled with vibrant stalls of fruit and cloth, had transformed into something almost hushed. A few merchants set up tables with bundles of firewood, jars of pickled vegetables, and skeins of wool. Their voices carried more clearly in the cold air, conversations stretching longer than the transactions themselves. The fountain's steady trickle continued, its edges thick with ice, the water's song muffled but never silenced. Children gathered around it with mittened hands, daring each other to touch the frozen edges, squealing when their fingers stuck briefly to the frost. Inside the homes, the rhythm of winter unfolded with its own rituals. Fires crackled constantly, consuming stacks of carefully cut wood that families had prepared in autumn. Iron pots simmered over the flames, filling rooms with the fragrance of slow stews and roasted roots. Quilts, patched with care and history, were pulled higher in the evenings, layered thickly over beds. The sound of wind against the shutters became part of the nightly lullaby, a reminder of the cold kept at bay by the warmth within. Winter gatherings shifted indoors, but lost none of their intimacy. Neighbors arrived carrying baskets of bread or jars of honey, shaking snow from their coats before stepping inside. Boots lined the doorways and laughter filled the rooms. Stories were told not with haste, but with lingering pauses, each silence as full of meaning as the words themselves. Some evenings, the fiddle or a harmonica would emerge, filling the air with tunes that rose and fell like the wind outside, sometimes light-hearted, sometimes low and solemn. No one hurried the music, no one demanded another verse. They let the sound stretch out, drifting into the quiet between breaths. For the children, winter carried its own magic. They pulled sleds up the gentle slopes near the fields, racing back down with shrieks that rang through the still air. They built forts from packed snow, their walls rising higher each day, decorated with icicles carefully collected from roof edges. At night, they pressed their faces to cold windows to watch the snow continue its endless fall, their reflections ghost-like against the glass. For them, the season was not slow. It was alive, full of wonder in each flake, each glittering drift. But for the adults, winter was a season of patience, chopping wood, mending clothes, tending to livestock. Each task was done deliberately, each step taken with care. The days blurred together in their quiet sameness, marked less by the calendar and more by the subtle changes in the light, the slight lengthening of afternoons as the season inched forward. The people of the town had long ago learned to live within this rhythm. They did not complain of the cold, nor wish it away. They understood that winter, like all things, had its place in the turning wheel of time. Night brought with it the deepest stillness. The snow reflected moonlight so brightly that the streets glowed even in the absence of lanterns. Stars burned sharp above, scattered like frost across the sky. Standing at the edge of the square, one could hear the faintest sounds, the groan of ice shifting on the river, the whisper of snowflakes brushing against roofs, the distant bark of a dog. The silence was not empty, but full, layered with the weight of a town entirely at rest. On certain nights, when the sky cleared after a storm, the aurora would stretch faintly across the horizon, delicate ribbons of green and violet that shimmered above the rooftops. People would step outside, pulling shawls tightly around their shoulders, and watch in silence. No one spoke. Words would have broken the spell. The lights came rarely, and when they did, they seemed like a secret gift, a reminder that even in the town's timeless rhythm, there were still surprises, still wonders that could not be predicted. The animals moved with the same patience as their human companions. Horses stamped slowly in their stalls, steam rising from their nostrils. Cows huddled close in barns, their lowing muffled by the hay. Dogs padded through the snow, leaving trails that vanished within the hour. Even the birds, fewer now, moved deliberately. Sparrows hopping near the bakery door to find crumbs. Crows calling from bare trees with voices that carried sharply through the crisp air. What struck any outsider who stayed long enough was not the cold, nor the snow, but the way the town seemed untouched by hurry. Where elsewhere winter might bring impatience, wishing for spring, longing for warmth, here it was accepted fully. The snow was not an obstacle, but a companion, shaping the pace of each day. The season was not endured. It was lived in its fullness, in its slowness, in its quiet majesty. And so the town carried on, its rhythm deeper than ever, its pulse slower, its days blending into one another like drifts of snow piling higher. There was no sense of loss in this sameness. To the people, it was abundance, abundance of time, abundance of silence, abundance of presence. Life was not measured in what changed, but in what endured. The fire that burned each night, the fountain that never froze completely, the constellations that wheeled steadily above the rooftops. Winter in the timeless town was not a season to be passed through. It was a season to be inhabited, to be breathed in, to be carried like a weight and a gift. It asked for nothing but attention, and in return, it gave a sense of eternity, an assurance that life, even when slowed to its quietest beat, was still whole, still complete, still endlessly unfolding. And so, beneath the endless fall of snow, the town rested, not waiting, not rushing, but simply being. Its people, its animals, its stones and trees and rivers, all held together in the slow, steady rhythm that had always defined it. A rhythm outside of time, outside of urgency, outside of change. A rhythm that whispered, softly and endlessly, that here in this place, life could be lived in its purest, slowest form. Spring did not burst into the timeless town with noise or haste. It arrived the way everything else did here, softly, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The snow that had layered itself over rooftops, fences, and cobblestones began to loosen its hold, melting into rivulets that trickled down the sides of streets and pooled quietly at the edges of fields. The air shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of thawing earth, of damp wood, of something green just beginning to stir beneath the soil. Morning by morning, the changes became clearer. The mist that rose over the river grew lighter, no longer thick with the weight of frost. Birds returned, their songs tentative at first, as though testing the air before committing to melody. Sparrows flitted between bare branches, crows called from the high rooftops, and somewhere in the orchards, a lark's trill broke the silence in a way that made the town feel as though it were exhaling after a long-held breath. The fountain, which had murmured faithfully even through the coldest months, now sang more freely, its edges no longer rimmed with ice. Children leaned over its edge once more, dipping hands into water that ran cold but no longer froze their fingertips. Their laughter, bright and unrestrained, echoed against the walls of the square, a sound that carried the same weight as any sermon, any prayer. It was a hymn of return, of renewal, of simple joy. The townspeople, too, moved differently. Scarves were still wrapped around their necks, but coats hung a little looser, buttons left undone in the warmth of midday. Boots left wet trails on the cobblestones as snow melted beneath them. Farmers walked their fields with eyes turned downward, searching for the first signs of life beneath the soil. A few green shoots appeared, fragile but certain, and each one was greeted with a kind of reverence that only comes from patience. The square slowly regained its energy. Stalls returned, their tables filled with what little early harvests the land offered. Wild greens, jars of last year's preserves, skeins of yarn dyed in soft colors that reminded one of flowers not yet in bloom. The conversations grew livelier, too. People lingered to talk not only of the season's slow turning, but of the plans that followed it. Planting, building, repairing. The rhythm was still slow, still deliberate, but it carried within it a sense of momentum, a gentle pushing forward that winter had held in suspension. By afternoon, the orchards were alive with change. Buds swelled on branches, and the air carried hints of blossoms waiting for their moment. The fields darkened with the rich, damp soil that had been buried under snow, ready once more for the plow. Horses, freed from their stalls more often now, trotted lazily across paddocks, their breath no longer visible in the air. Dogs ran more freely, chasing after children with renewed energy. Even the river, once dulled by ice, glittered with movement, reflecting the returning sun with a brightness that made eyes narrow and hearts lift. Evenings in spring carried their own kind of magic. The sunsets stretched longer, spilling pink and orange across the horizon before sinking into deep blue. Windows glowed with lamplight once again, but now they were often left open, letting in cool breezes that smelled faintly of grass and rain. Families gathered around tables, but doors were more often left ajar, allowing the sounds of the season to mingle with the warmth inside. In those moments, the boundaries between home and world seemed thinner, as if everything were woven together in one shared breath. As weeks passed, the blossoms finally arrived. Trees along the square and in the orchards erupted into clouds of white and pink, petals drifting down with every breeze like soft snow from another season. The streets became carpeted in color, each step scattering blossoms into the air. Children collected them in baskets, while older townsfolk walked slowly, pausing to look upward as though they had never seen such a thing before, even though they had, year after year. That was the secret of the town. No repetition ever dulled its beauty. Each cycle was received as though it were the first. The rhythm of the town, which had slowed nearly to stillness in winter, now found a new beat. Not hurried, but steadier, stronger. Work began in earnest. Fields were tilled, roofs were repaired, new fences were built. Yet even this labor was touched with patience. Men paused to wipe brows and share stories. Women leaned on baskets and laughed together. Children chased after each other between rows of sprouting crops. Time stretched, but no one sought to shorten it. There was no rush to finish, only the satisfaction of doing, of being present in the work itself. Night brought softer rains, tapping gently against roofs and windows. The smell of wet earth filled every room, a promise that the world was waking again. Families lay in bed listening, the sound steady and calming, as though the rain itself had folded into the lullaby of the town. Sometimes thunder rolled far off, not loud enough to frighten, but deep enough to remind everyone of the vastness beyond. Yet even then, the town remained steady, cocooned within its own rhythm, its own sense of eternity. What spring revealed most clearly was that time in this place did not move forward so much as it circled, looping gently through seasons, through days, through moments that repeated but never lost their meaning. Each year the snow fell, each year the blossoms came, each year the fields ripened, each year the leaves fell again. And yet, to the people of the town, nothing ever felt old. Each return was a gift, each pattern a reminder that life was not a race, but a rhythm. A steady song that carried on without beginning or end. As the blossoms gave way to fruit, as the soil darkened with growth, as the town leaned further into the fullness of spring, its timeless quality became undeniable. For here, in this place, no one chased what was next. They lived instead in what was now, in the warmth of the hearth, in the cool of the evening breeze, in the laughter of children, in the quiet conversations by the fountain. The town's slow rhythm was not a flaw to be corrected, nor a weakness to be outgrown. It was the very heart of life itself. And so, the timeless town carried on, not with fanfare, not with urgency, but with a patient, steady grace that belonged only to places unclaimed by haste. Its story did not end, because such a story has no ending. It simply continued, season after season, breath after breath, step after step, an endless unfolding of the slow rhythm that made it eternal. Summer did not erupt upon the timeless town with heat and thunder. It unfolded gradually, as all things here did. The season's arrival was like a long exhale after the softness of spring. Days stretched wider, longer, and brighter. Yet the pace of life remained unhurried, bound to the rhythm that time itself seemed to honor. The first signs of summer came in the warmth that lingered even after dusk. The chill of night retreated, replaced by air that held the faint smell of ripening fruit, of grass warmed by the sun, of river water flowing steady and deep. Fields darkened with lush growth, rows of crops rising in confident green lines, their leaves rustling in the gentlest of breezes. Farmers leaned against their tools, gazing across the expanse with quiet satisfaction. There was no rush for the harvest. It would come in its own time, as it always did. Children, freed from the weight of winter and the rains of spring, filled the days with play. Their laughter echoed down narrow alleys and across the open square, a sound as constant as the fountain's gentle flow. Barefoot, they darted across grass and dirt, chasing each other with the simple urgency of joy. Their games were timeless, the same ones played by their parents and grandparents, the same ones that would be played long after. By midday, the town seemed to glow under the sun. Whitewashed walls gleamed, wooden shutters cast shadows across cobblestones, and the square shimmered with heat that softened edges and slowed footsteps. Yet no one hurried. Men rested in doorways, women carried baskets beneath wide-brimmed hats, children lingered in shade. The rhythm of summer was not one of rushing through the heat, but of moving with it, conserving energy the way the earth itself conserved its strength for harvest. The river became the heart of summer. Its waters, no longer edged with ice nor swollen with spring rains, flowed steady and cool. Children splashed in the shallows, their laughter carrying downstream. Older boys swam farther out, their heads bobbing above the current, daring one another to reach the far bank. Fishermen cast their lines from quiet bends, waiting patiently, more for the peace of the water than the catch. At dusk, families gathered along its banks, sharing bread, cheese, fruit, and stories, while the water reflected the fading light. In the orchards, the trees bore heavy promises. Blossoms had given way to swelling fruit. Apples blushed green to red, pears lengthened, cherries deepened into dark jewels. The air itself seemed scented with sweetness, a fragrance that carried across fields and into town. Children picked the early fruit with sticky fingers, while their elders gently scolded, and then joined them with knowing smiles. Every bite was slow, savored, as though each fruit carried within it the memory of seasons past and the promise of seasons to come. Evenings stretched long into twilight. The sun lingered on the horizon, painting the sky in vast sweeps of pink, orange, and gold. Windows glowed warmly as families gathered, but often doors remained open, spilling lamplight onto streets where neighbors still sat, talking, singing, or simply being together. Musicians brought out fiddles and flutes, and soft tunes drifted into the air. Couples danced barefoot on cobblestones, children clapped in rhythm, elders tapped their feet from wooden chairs. It was not a festival, not a planned celebration, but an everyday joy, life itself becoming its own kind of music. Sometimes storms came, not the biting blizzards of winter, nor the soft rains of spring, but the rolling, powerful storms of summer. Thunder cracked across the hills, lightning lit up the fields in sudden brilliance, and rain poured in torrents that made the river swell and the earth drink deeply. Yet even in this, there was no fear. Families gathered by windows, watching the storm together. Children counted seconds between lightning and thunder, their voices rising in a chorus of awe. When it passed, the air smelled of wet earth and renewal, and frogs croaked joyfully from ditches and ponds. The heat of midday sometimes pressed heavy, but the town knew how to meet it. Work was done early or late, with rest at noon when the sun was strongest. Families napped in the shade. Hammocks swayed gently. Shutters closed against the brightness. The fountain's voice was louder then, echoing in the stillness, a cool reminder of water's constant gift. By afternoon, life resumed with the same unhurried grace, as though the town itself inhaled and exhaled with the rhythm of the sun. As the season ripened, the fields grew thick and golden. Wheat swayed like a sea under the breeze, each stalk bending and rising in slow unison. Farmers walked among them with reverence, knowing the harvest was near, but never hurrying it. There was patience in their steps, the same patience that had carried them through winter and spring. For here, no hand rushed the earth. It gave in its own time, and they received with gratitude. Festivals arose not by calendar, but by seasons turning. When cherries were ripe, families gathered in orchards, eating until fingers and lips were stained red. When the river ran low enough, children built stone dams and watched the water pool and spill. When fireflies returned, evenings were lit with their glow, children chasing them with jars only to release them again. A ritual of wonder. Each moment, no matter how ordinary, became a celebration. At night, summer revealed its quiet majesty. Stars scattered across skies so clear they seemed infinite. The Milky Way stretched overhead, a soft river of light that mirrored the one below. Families sat outside long after the day's heat faded, speaking in hushed voices or simply listening to the night's song. Crickets in grass, owls in orchards, the gentle lap of water. Children fell asleep in their mothers' laps, carried home through streets that glowed faintly with starlight. The timeless town lived through summer, not as a passage to something else, but as a fullness in itself. Each day was whole, each evening complete. There was no countdown to autumn, no longing for what was next. Life here unfolded as the river flowed, steady and sure, moving but never rushing, carrying all things within it. And as the days stretched longest, as fields bent heavy with grain and trees sagged with fruit, the people knew, without words, without plans, that time was not a line but a circle. The rhythm of seasons was their heartbeat, their prayer, their song. Summer would give way, as spring had, as winter had, as autumn would. But nothing was lost. Everything remained, renewed in its own time. So the town, eternal in its patience, moved through summer with the same quiet grace it had through every season. Work, rest, play, storm, sun, night, morning. Each flowed into the next, each complete, each part of the endless unfolding. The people did not hurry to meet tomorrow. They lived in today, and in that, they touched eternity. Autumn arrived in the timeless town not with sudden winds or abrupt chills, but with a gentle turning of the light. The days, once long and heavy with summer's warmth, softened into cooler afternoons. The sun leaned lower in the sky, its rays striking the cobblestones and fields at an angle that made everything glow with a golden tenderness. Shadows stretched longer, evenings came sooner, and in that shift, the entire town seemed to breathe differently, as though even time itself paused, taking in the quiet grandeur of the season's arrival. The orchards, which only weeks before had been heavy with ripe fruit, now displayed their transformation. Leaves burned into colors of fire, scarlet, amber, russet, and gold. The air was filled with their slow descent, each leaf falling as if reluctant to let go of the branch, yet graceful in surrender. Children ran through the piles, their laughter rising into the cool air as leaves swirled around them. The crunch beneath their feet was as steady and comforting as a drumbeat, a rhythm that accompanied the season's song. In the fields, the wheat had already been harvested, the stalks cut and bundled, the earth resting after its labor. Scarecrows stood guard over empty rows, their straw arms stretched wide as if welcoming the sky. Farmers moved slowly, their work now centered on storing grain, pressing apples into cider, and stacking firewood for the months ahead. Yet even in this labor, there was no rush, no frantic sense of time running out. Every motion was measured, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though each task was an offering to the season itself. The square carried autumn's mark in its own way. Stalls overflowed with baskets of apples, jars of honey thick and golden, gourds of every shape and color. The fountain, still flowing, reflected the trees around it like a living painting, its water shimmering with red and gold fragments. People lingered longer than before, their conversations slower, their voices quieter, as if even their speech bowed to the hush of the season. They spoke of harvests, of winter preparations, of memories of other autumns, each word drifting into the cool air like falling leaves. Evenings in autumn carried a distinct kind of peace. The air grew brisk, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Windows glowed warmly, lanterns swung from doorways, and the streets were lined with the faint golden mist of twilight. Families gathered earlier around their hearths, the firelight flickering across faces as stories were told and songs were sung. Children curled beneath quilts, listening to the cadence of voices that seemed as steady and timeless as the turning of the seasons. Festivals came, not with fanfare, but with a quiet joy that seemed woven into the very fabric of the town. When the last apples were picked, neighbors gathered to press cider, their hands sticky with sweetness, their laughter mingling with the squeak of wooden presses. Bonfires were lit in the square, flames leaping into the dark, sparks rising like fleeting stars. People circled the fires, not to celebrate an ending, but to honor the season itself, its beauty, its abundance, its gentle reminder that change need not be loss. The river mirrored autumn's shift as well. Once bright and quick under summer's sun, it now carried fallen leaves upon its surface, their colors drifting lazily downstream. Children leaned from its banks, poking at the floating reds and yellows with sticks, while older folk gazed at the reflection of the sky, brilliant at dusk, silver under moonlight. The water seemed slower, deeper, as though it too had taken on the season's patience. Storms came less often, but when they did, they carried the scent of earth and wood. Rain fell with a steady rhythm, soaking the fields and orchards, drumming softly against roofs. families watched from their windows as mist rose from the hills, the entire world wrapped in a gray veil. And when the storms passed, the air was clear and sharp, the colors even more vivid against the washed sky. Autumn nights brought with them a kind of intimacy. The stars shone sharper, framed by the silhouettes of bare branches. The moon rose larger, casting silver paths across fields and rivers. Couples walked slowly through leaf-strewn lanes, their steps muffled by the carpet of color. Elders sat on porches wrapped in shawls, gazing into the stillness, their thoughts wandering like the leaves on the breeze. Children pressed their noses to windows, tracing constellations with small fingers before being pulled into bed. In autumn, the town seemed most itself, rooted in its slowness, defined by its acceptance of change. For here, the falling of leaves was not a loss, but a renewal, a reminder that life's rhythm was circular, not linear. The people did not mourn the fading of summer, nor dread the coming of winter. They lived within the turning, accepting it as part of the whole. Each leaf that fell, each field left bare, each day that shortened was a note in the eternal song the town always sang. And so, the timeless town moved deeper into autumn, wrapped in gold and fire, held in the arms of a season that whispered both of endings and beginnings. The world outside might have hurried, marking calendars, counting hours, fearing time's passing. But here, in this place untouched by haste, autumn was not a fleeting moment, but an entire world, complete, unbroken, eternal in its slow unfolding. The leaves would all fall, the trees would stand bare, the frost would come, but none of it was loss. It was simply the turning of the rhythm, the steady circle of time that the town had always known and always would. In every breath of cool air, in every leaf drifting to earth, in every fire lit against the dark, the town touched eternity once more. Winter's return to the timeless town was not an abrupt event, not a shattering of the world's gentle rhythm. It arrived as all things here did, slowly, quietly, with a grace that allowed the heart to adjust long before the eyes could see. The first hints came in the air. Mornings grew sharper, breath turned visible, and the wind carried a thin, crystalline edge. Frost painted delicate filigree across window panes, and the river, once busy carrying autumn's leaves, began to slow, its surface stiffening in the cool embrace of ice. By late November, the colors of autumn had faded entirely. The golds and reds of leaves gave way to bare branches stretching upward like black ink strokes against a pale sky. The fields lay resting, their work done, their soil dark and still, waiting for the blanket that would soon cover them. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys in every quarter of the town, a signal that hearths had taken their central place once again. Winter was not feared nor fought. It was welcomed, an old companion returning for its part in the cycle. Children were the first to celebrate its arrival. Their laughter rang through the square as flurries turned into snowfall, flakes drifting lazily at first, and then thickening into a soft curtain of white. They ran with arms stretched wide, trying to catch snowflakes on their tongues, stamping footprints into the fresh powder before it could lie untouched. Soon, the sound of sleds scraping down hills joined the stillness, their shouts of joy echoing against quiet houses. To them, winter was never slow or solemn. It was alive, playful, and full of wonder. The square transformed under the snow. The fountain froze in places, its flowing water locked in crystal curves that caught and reflected light like glass. Market stalls, fewer now, were draped in frost, their tables lined with preserved fruits, nuts, and bundles of kindling. Woolen scarves and mittens, knitted in patient evenings, were displayed like treasures. Every exchange carried warmth, not just of goods, but of words, of greetings, of shared patience in the cold. Even as the wind bit sharper, people lingered, their conversations as unhurried as ever, steam rising from their mouths with every syllable. Inside the homes, winter deepened into ritual. Fires were stoked at dawn, their glow carrying into every corner. The scent of wood smoke mixed with bread baking in ovens, with herbs simmering in broths, meant to warm the body against the chill. Families drew closer to one another, gathered around the hearth where shadows flickered across faces. Evenings were filled with stories, passed from one generation to the next, told slowly, carefully, as though words themselves carried weight in the stillness. Laughter was softer, but no less real, a gentle balm against the long nights. Winter nights here were not feared for their darkness, but revered for their quiet. The stars, sharper now in the cold sky, seemed closer, brighter, as though the heavens themselves leaned down to listen. The moon lit the snow-covered fields, turning them silver, endless, eternal. Footsteps crunched across frozen paths, each sound carrying far in the silence. Lanterns glowed faintly in windows, scattered pinpricks of warmth across the town, their light as steady as the beating of a heart. Festivals marked the season in their quiet way. When the snow lay deepest, families carried lanterns into the square, their lights glowing against the black of night. They sang songs that rose into the cold air, voices weaving together in simple harmonies. Children held hands and spun circles in the snow, their joy aflame against the frost. A great fire was lit in the center, sparks racing upward to join the stars. No one spoke of endings or beginnings, only of the moment itself, this gathering, this warmth, this shared breath of life against the winter air. The river, slowed by ice, became a place of wonder. Its banks frosted over, its surface shimmering under moonlight. Children skated on its shallower stretches, their movements clumsy but joyous, while elders watched from the shore, wrapped in furs and memories. The sound of skates scratching against ice was delicate, almost musical, blending with the occasional crack of ice shifting beneath the weight of the season. Even in stillness, the river lived on, carrying its slow song beneath the frozen surface. As the weeks passed, the snow deepened. Roofs wore heavy caps of white. Fences disappeared beneath drifts, and trees bent under the weight of winter's gift. Paths were carved slowly, by footsteps and shovels, winding like veins through the whiteness. Horses pulled sledges instead of carts, their breath steaming in the air, bells on their harnesses jingling softly as they moved through the quiet streets. Each sound, the creak of wood, the crunch of snow, the call of a distant crow, was magnified in the stillness. Yet winter was not only beauty. It demanded patience. Wood had to be split and stacked, food rationed carefully, fires tended through the night. Storms rolled in from the hills, snow piling high, winds howling against shutters. Families huddled together, listening as the world roared outside, finding strength in closeness. And when the storms passed, the silence that followed was almost holy, an emptiness so profound it seemed to cleanse the air itself. Through it all, the rhythm remained. Work slowed, rest deepened, conversation stretched long into evenings. Time here did not chase forward. It circled, turned, folded back upon itself. Winter was not an ending, but a pause, a breath before the cycle began anew. And the people, as always, moved with it, never rushing, never resisting, always part of the endless unfolding. As the season wore on, a truth became clear, not spoken, not written, but felt. The town itself was not just a place on a map, not just houses and streets and fields. It was a living rhythm, a steady heartbeat outside the noise of the world. Its timelessness did not come from resisting change, but from embracing it fully, each season honored, each moment whole. And so, as winter deepened, as snow continued to fall, As fires burned steadily against the long nights, the town remained eternal. For here, time did not pass. It turned, it circled, it returned. Spring would come again, summer would bloom, autumn would burn gold, winter would fall quiet. The cycle would repeat endlessly, without urgency, without haste. The timeless town was never about endings. It was about continuity, about living within the rhythm rather than against it, about finding eternity not in grand monuments or fleeting triumphs, but in the slow, steady unfolding of ordinary days. And so the story rests here, in the hush of winter, in the glow of hearth fires, in the silence of snow falling against rooftops. Not with a conclusion, not with a final word, but with a reminder. Life, like the seasons, never truly ends. It turns, it returns, it flows on. And within that flow, if one is still enough, quiet enough, patient enough, eternity can be touched in the slow rhythm of a timeless town.